What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over another episode of the input mapping and binding controls screen in the settings menu. In the previous episode we set up this logic where we could move around our settings menu, change to a different tab, such as the controls tab, and then enter this tab and control it with actual keys on a keyboard or inputs on a gamepad. We did not go over being able to actually edit these controls in here based on gamepad or keyboard controls. We only allowed them to work based off of mouse inputs. So if I use my mouse and I select the input key selector and then I press a key, I can change the key. And the same does go for the gamepad as well. However, we also want to be able to control these with our keyboard or gamepad because if we are a player, we may not be using the mouse, and thus we'll want to be able to use whatever controller we are using. So now I'll be able to come in here, confirm it. I'm going to bring up a pop-up. This just says press any input, and it's going to have the input that is currently selected. And then when I press one, it is going to remove the pop-up and change the binding. At this point, after this episode, everything related to this menu will be able to be used and controlled using gamepads or the keyboards. And we won't have to worry about using the mouse if we don't want to. We technically do have these key selectors that I've not set up on the keyboard or the gamepad. I will go over them in another episode on this topic, but we're approaching the end of this. The main things that I want to do after this episode are add player 1 and player 2, because if you are playing locally, player 2's controls can also be bound, especially if you're on a keyboard or a device that supports multiple players. Settings selectors in there as well, being able to control them without the use of a mouse. And then we'll go over macros as well. The macros will most likely have their own episode as the third part of macros because they are a little bit more complicated than these input key selectors. But otherwise their input logic for the gamepads and the keyboard will be the same. So with that said, we can go ahead and get started. Before we do, I'd like to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support, for everything that you do, and for encouraging me to keep working on this series. I really, really love this series, and I'm glad you guys are as excited about it as I am. If you'd like to get caught up in this series before you watch this episode, so you can check out everything we've done to reach this point, and you can click this icon right here in the top right corner. It'll lead you to the entire playlist, so you can see every episode I worked on that's been related to this series. Alternatively, you can go ahead and click this icon right here, which is the previous episode of the settings and changing controls menu. That'll be useful because we are going to be building off of that logic more today, so you want to watch that one before you watch this one. We can go ahead and get started. We can start in the code today, and we can go to our base player controller, or your main controller that you're using for everything. If I scroll down on my controller, we can look at two things. First of all, we need a new variable of a widget, because if we're going to be able to control widgets through the code, we do need to know which one we're controlling, or we need to send out a call to all of them, and we can control multiple. Now, depending on how we want to handle it, either way is fine. You could want to do that. I'm going to keep track of the widget that I am on. This way I know that I can edit that widget and only that widget, kind of like focusing that specific widget. To do this, I'm actually going to make a variable of a UWidget pointer, so I can just keep track of the specific widget that I'm on. It's not a big deal to make this. However, we actually can't make this and bind it to a U property where we can edit in the blueprint this easily. There is something else we have to do to make this work. It's something we've never done yet in the series. We'll have to do it one time, then it'll work across all of our files. So you can go ahead and start writing this if you want. Make a UWidget pointer current widget. Now to do this, we are going to need to include components/widget.h up at the top. That's how we can get the UWidget type in here so that this variable is found. The asterisk is the pointer. So we're going to point at the widget that we're currently focusing. and calling commands or controls on. And then give it whatever name you want. Again, I call it current widget. Now at this point, this would actually work, but I need to be able to access this widget in the blueprint because right now, all of our widgets are created in the editor, and the code doesn't interface with them directly. In this case, in today's episode, it is going to. So I need to know exactly what widget we are on, and since we're not spawning them from the code, we need a way to set that. So I need to make sure that I can have this variable set in the blueprints when a blueprint is spawned. So I gave this variable a U property of edit anywhere, blueprint read write, and a category of widget. The category is not required. I just do that for organizational purposes. But we do want it to be edit anywhere and blueprint read write. However, if you try and do this, it will fail. There's something we have to do here that we've never touched on before. So the way we can actually edit these blueprints and these widgets, make them U properties, and change these values in the blueprint is to go into our fighter template.build.cs, or basically the name of your project.build.cs. It's under games, your solution file, source, and then it's a C# file. Go ahead and double click that or open it up any way you see fit. And when you come in here, it's going to look pretty similar to this. I've not changed anything in here except for one thing. So yours should match pretty much exactly. It could change a little bit depending on the version or if you've had to edit things in here before. We have to add the ability to support UMG or Unreal Motion graphics. And this is how we're going to be able to interface with our widgets a lot more easily by actually being able to set references to them, pass along data from the code to the blueprint, and vice versa. So in your public dependency module names.add range, it's going to have some things here, such as core, core UObject, engine, input core, and it could have a few others, again, depending on your project and the version and some other stuff. But the important part here is that you have UMG. If you don't have this, you have to add it like I did. To do this, you can add a comma after the last string within these curly braces. And then put another string in here that you call UMG. Has to be that specifically because Unreal looks for that and uses that. Including that actually allows us to make that widget that we set up in the base player controller, blueprint read write, and edit anywhere. Gives it that U property functionality. Now you can go back to your base player controller, and this should now compile properly. You can go into your base player controller.cpp, and you can do a few things here. You can set this to a default value if you'd like in the constructor. To do so, just go into your constructor, grab your new variable, which is current widget, and you can set it to null pointer. Having that in there won't hurt anything, and you'll just know that it's null by default, but it could very easily be assigned by a blueprint or even in the code with a reference to a widget, or really we're going to point at a widget. In the constructor, it's fine as default. You can just default that value. And now what we need is to have a section in our controller where we had an any key input. If we had a bind action on any key, which is an input action that we have in our project settings, bound to any key, having this binding means that this function will be called anytime we press any key, and this goes for gamepad inputs as well. They use the term key, but it does work for buttons and axes and triggers and all this stuff. Basically, any input was passed. Now, it's important we do this because our little binding widget here should support any key. When we come into our settings menu, if I want to bind the jump key to insert, then I can press that. If I want to bind the light attack to numpad 9, I can do that. If I want to bind the medium attack to enter, I can do that. If I want to bind the heavy attack to asterisk, I can do that. So I can choose any key on my keyboard or, again, any input on your gamepad. So we need to support any key. There could be keys that you don't allow. We can cover that as well. Right now I'm allowing any key. We're not going to make it too complicated for today's episode. We're just going to work off of our any key function that gets called. So I already have this. If you skipped around, it's possible that you don't have this, but long story short, in your setup input component, you're going to need a bind action to some sort of any key action mapping that calls a function. Since we already have one and set this function up earlier in the series, I am going to use this one, but it's okay if you're using a different function because nothing else in the function really matters. We're just going to make sure that we know when this function is called. So you can go ahead and scroll down to that function, whether you made a new one or already have one. For me, it's determine input device details. Now, before we get into the actual logic that's going to happen in here, we have to make sure that we have an appropriate reaction in the widget for when a key is pressed. For that widget pop-up that disappears when any key is pressed, that is this right here, we need a way to track that a key was pressed and then perform an action. We do this, and we have done this in the series a few times, by using our widget navigation interface. So you can open this up again. Remember, widget navigation interface has nothing in the CPP currently, and in .h it just has some functions that we can call when inputs are pressed. Then these functions can be handled by the specific widget to do whatever logic it is that it needs to do. To this point, we had 4 functions: move up, move down, confirm, and back. You may have added more, or you may not have needed all these. But we do need a new one today. So in our widget navigation interface, I've made a new function, and I've called it void any key. Now, I make sure that it is U function, blueprint implementable event, and blueprint callable. So we can call it from another blueprint if we want, although we actually don't need this today. We do need blueprint implementable event because we're going to fill out the logic that's going to happen on this widget when any key is pressed. So the main thing we need is blueprint implementable event. And we need to make sure that we're passing in a parameter of f key. I'm just calling it key pressed, but you can call it input pressed, whatever. Again, key here is more of a generic name. It actually works for any input, it works for gamepads as well. Now, any key is the function that we need to call on the interface when the base player controller any key function fires. So our base player any key function is determine input device details. It takes in a key pressed that it gathers when the player presses an input. We're going to use this key pressed and pass it along to the widget navigation interface any key. And that's going to allow us to determine what key we pressed so that we know what key to bind each action to on that menu. So inside this function, these nodes here are all I've added. Everything else in this function is stuff related to changing between gamepad and keyboard in the middle of a match and some other complicated things. So we're only worried about these lines that are highlighted today. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that there is a current widget. In today's episode, I did not go through and assign every widget that we are on, nor did I go through and override all the old widget logic we had to work with the player controllers. However, we do still need to know if there is any widget up, because if there's not, we're going to be trying to call this function or this event on an object that does not exist, which will of course fail. It will crash or at the least give an error and not do the operation you're trying to do. So we only want to do this logic if there is a current widget. So we check against our widget variable that we made in the .h file right here. And we just check if it exists, if it's valid. Then if it is, we're going to do this line here. You may have seen this line earlier in the series. We've used it a few places, but we never really used it in a spot where it would make sense. We called menu up, menu down, menu confirm, and we were checking if this, the base player controller instance, class implements the interface. The base player controller does not implement the widget navigation interface, so these were never going to succeed. So instead we handle them in the blueprint. Now I covered that in the episode where we did the versus pause menu and the command lists menu. But this was really just a placeholder. This is how we do it. However, we know that the base player controller does not implement this interface, so these were never going to succeed. This is because we never had any sort of code directly to widget communication properties. We never had a process where we could actually do this. So that was kind of just template. But here, we're doing it the correct way. We're going to check our current widget get class, okay? So this is the object reference of the widget, and then we're going to get the overall class. In this case, we're going to be using our new widget that we're going to make, the control mapping pop-up. We'll get more into that when we're in the blueprint. So it's going to get that control mapping pop-up, and it's going to see if it implements the widget navigation interface, which of course we are going to make it do so. Since that succeeds, we are going to be able to call the AnyKey function on the interface using this object. Then we're going to also pass in the key pressed to pass that data along as well. So we can use our widget navigation interface. This is how you call interface functions in code like this. We call execute, and then we put the name of the function. Execute underscore name of the function. So execute underscore AnyKey, and then we need to pass in the object that we're executing it on. This case is the current widget, because many objects could take this function. So we want to call it on the current widget. Then we have to pass in the parameter list for AnyKey. AnyKey has an F key pressed in here so that we can keep track of what input was actually pressed. So we pass along key pressed that comes from the AnyKey parameter list in the function above. And now what this will do is actually execute the AnyKey event, which is a blueprint implementable event, on the current widget. So this widget will be up. Then we'll go ahead and override the event AnyKey and fill out the logic in here. And that's how the flow is going to work. So we are good with the code, but at this point we are able to transfer some data directly from the code to the specific widget that we are handling. Let's go into the editor and let's start where we left off. Let's go to the change control screen. So this is this overall screen that we have here. Now, when we press these, if we click on these with the mouse, like this, it brings up an ellipsis and then it waits for a key input. It's not so simple to bring that up with custom inputs if we're not using an input such as enter. Even if I'm over top of an object, if I hit enter, then it will work, but it's not going to work with custom navigation. So instead what we're going to do is kind of override this logic to work with a pop-up instead. The pop-up can then capture any inputs we give it and fill it back into this spot, while still giving the user visuals of what's going on, so they know that what they input is overriding this value. So we're going to need to make a widget to do that. So as always, you can go to where you want your widgets to be. I'm going to add new user interface widget blueprint. I'm going to rename mine to control mapping pop-up and open it up. At this point, I have three little things here. One is just the background. I just made this so that you guys can see it and that it looks good, or it looks a little bit better than just floating text. And this is an image that I just brought onto the screen. You know, chose my position, my anchors, my alpha, my color. Then we can go to the next part, which is text. This is just the title of the pop-up, so I just have press any input. And maybe you could do ... something like that to let the player know that you're waiting for input. You can see all my settings, but again, there's nothing really important here. I'm not binding this. This is just my personal settings for how I made this widget look. Then I have text that I actually bind, which is the text of the input key that the parent key selector. So if we're on jump key selector, it's going to grab the text that is bound to jump, or the name of the key that is bound to jump, and then display that name here. So I have another piece of text, and I've given it default text of gamepad left face button, but I've also bound it right here. So you can see what I've got here. Feel free to pause it or slow it down if you want to check mine out. But again, this is all visuals. The important part is the binding. So once you've selected this text, you can go add binding. When you click this the first time, it'll be add binding. I already have one, so mine's a little bit different. Once you add it, it will automatically bring you to the graph to your binding. And you'll have something similar to this. Get input name text. And you'll have a return node that takes in text. What we're going to need to do is get the result of the input bound to the action and print that out here, or return that to this node. However, to do that, we need to know what this widget is being spawned for. Like I said, you could spawn one for jump, for light attack, medium attack. We don't have one that works for all because each input could be bound differently. Each action mapping could be bound differently. So we're going to need a few variables in our graph before we can actually do this binding. You can see I already have a widget here for the background that is a variable. I don't need to do anything with that. That was just made because the image was a variable. Checked here, so don't worry about that. But I do have some other things that I have set up in here, and these are what we really need to take care of. So we have two main things that we need to take care of here. One is the owner widget, and one is the currently selected key. So if you go ahead and make a variable, I called this one owner widget, and I set it to the change control screen widget. This is because this is the widget that's spawning the pop-up. This is like the parent widget, or the owner widget. So I called it the owner widget. And I'm going to set it to the object reference type of the widget that is spawning this pop-up. So for me, it is change control screen, and I want an object reference. Now, you can compile and save this. We also want to make this instance editable and expose on spawn. This way, as soon as this pop-up is spawned, we can already have this data. We're actually going to set it to change control screen data. We'll get into this in a second. However, I can show you an example. By making these expose on spawn, we can actually edit it when we're spawning this widget. And then instance editable means we can change it for every instance. So when we create this widget, we'll be able to pass in something to the owner widget. Now, going back to the pop-up, this guy here. We also are going to want a currently selected key. This is just for the binding. So we need to know what key was currently selected or what input was currently bound to this action. That way we can get the name and display it to the user. But we can also use it to compare against the previous input if we need to in the future. So I made a new variable. I called it currently selected key, and I set it to an input key selector object reference. Like that. Now, I've also made this instance editable and expose on spawn because we're going to do the same thing where we're passing data into it right away. This is an easy way to deal with all of the cases on here in one array, just one pass, passing in the one that we're on. So if we're on light attack, we're going to pass light attack. If we're on heavy, we're going to pass heavy, and we will get it to work in a very simple method. Now, I know we haven't set this yet because we haven't finished the change control screen logic, but we can go ahead and finish this binding off without setting it. So this binding to get the input name of the input that is bound to the input action is very simple. We can grab our currently selected key that we just made. Then we can drag off of this, and input key selectors have a selected key. Remember, input key selectors are these buttons here, where you can click on them and then press a button and it binds, or at least sets, the input name to this button. Okay, so the input key selector has the selected key. It already has to keep track of that, so we can get the selected key. Then, of course, from here, we can just get the name from it. And the way you do that is get input chord display name. This structure is an input chord, that's what they call it. And this just keeps track of, if I break this, you can see it keeps track of the actual key that was pressed, and then if any other key was pressed with it, such as Shift, Control, Alt, or Command. Okay. So you can just use the input chord display name and the return value, and you're good to go. You're done with this binding. It's that simple. We can go back into the event graph now. And I actually have a different function here that I don't need it anymore. So I'm going to delete it. You don't have to worry about what was inside of it. It is no longer required. So we can get rid of that. So we have our binding done, and now we're in our event graph. First thing we can fill out is event construct, and then we'll go into capturing our actual AnyKey event. So you may already have this on your widget, but if you don't, you can just search for event construct. Get it to pop up really easily. And there's two things we need to do now. So one, we need to get a controller reference, or we need to at least access the controller. We don't technically have to save a reference out. I just do that for ease. But we do need to get access to the controller. And then the other thing we need to do is set this widget, this pop-up widget, to be the current widget on the base player controller so that we can call the AnyKey event on it. Now, since this is a settings widget, it's pretty simple that you can use get player controller player index 0. In my opinion, this is actually fine because this will always be player 1. In this case, player 1 is going to be the one handling this. Now, when we go over the multiplayer, like I said in the intro here, that we might want to have player 2's inputs here. This could get a little bit more complicated. Instead of just using player index 0, we'll have to actually get the right player controller. But we'll worry about that in the next episode, because that does open up quite a bit of stuff we have to add to event construct here. But it doesn't actually change the logic that we have here, so don't stress over this. We're just going to bypass that until the next episode, because this has already got a lot jam-packed into it. So we want to get player controller, and I'm going to leave it at index 0 for now. Just know that player 1 will be the only player that is able to do that. And we're going to cast to base player controller, which is our code controller type. And you get these two nodes here. At this point, I decided to make a reference, but again, this isn't required. This is just for ease of access, so it's up to you if you want to do this. You can drag off your as base player controller and promote it to a variable. And I just called this the controller reference. Now, the controller reference is, again, the one that has the current widget variable we made earlier. And so we need to set this when we're on really any widget that we want to be able to control with the controller. This is the only one right now that we need to do this with, so it's perfectly fine if you only do it on this one, but if you want to go farther, that's fine too. We can now drag off our controller reference or off the cast if you're not using a reference, and set current widget. You'll get this value here, and the controller will be plugged into the target. But we need to actually assign it to something. Well, we're in the widget that is the current widget, so we just want to assign it to self. So you can drag off of this and type self and get a reference to self. That's how you can set up event construct. Now the controller is aware of the widget that we should be calling AnyKey on, so that's what we're going to set up next. However, to do this, we do need to inherit or implement that interface. So if we go to our class settings, we can go to implemented interface, add, and then you're going to want to find your widget navigation interface. I've already got it, so it takes it away from the list. But once you find it in there, it should appear here under implemented interfaces. Now compile and save. And once that works, you will be able to find this event now. So to do this, we right click in the graph and you can type event, AnyKey, and add event. You may have a few options that pop up. Interfaces can sometimes be weird with that, where they'll pop up either duplicate options or they pop up different options here, although these are intentional. The one you actually want is the add event. If you do the call function, you're going to get this, which is if we were trying to call it, but we don't have to call it, we're calling it from the controller. And then there is also the interface call here, which we don't need to do. That's, again, another type of call. We're not worried about that right now. So we want the event like this. Now, the event is going to have a key pressed. And this is going to be the key that we pressed so that we know what to bind that key selector to, and eventually the input action mapping to. The important logic is down here. I do have a little bit of a Boolean fix here that just stops us from immediately exiting out of the menu. So if we don't have this, this will still work, but let me show you what happens. I open this up, go to my settings, go to my change controls. Now when I press the confirm button, it's automatically binding these inputs to the confirm button. Because technically this widget is spawned, it has the current widget set, and event any key fires for the confirm button, which immediately goes through and tries to set the selected key to this confirm button. So what I do is I just make sure that if it's the initial input that is captured when this widget is opened, we ignore it, and then we accept the next one. So basically we press confirm, which opens up the widget, and then the next input we enter after that will be captured. Even if it is the confirm key, that's fine, it'll take that. It just, the very first key that's opening this widget should not automatically close the menu and set the selected key to that. So I have a small little fix here for that. It just blocks that flow of logic. So I've added a Boolean here that I call is initial input. And I actually default it to true. You might have to compile so that you can set the default value. Default to true. It's the initial input. If it is, we just want to disable it and don't do any other logic with it. Okay, so literally we grab is initial input, branch, and if it's true, we just set is initial input to false. Just like that. However, if it's false, meaning that we already popped open this widget, we can now go and proceed with the actual setting the appropriate value logic. So assuming it's false, we need to use key pressed, and we need to set the currently selected key to have this value. So say we pressed S, we want to say currently selected key is now going to hold S on the keyboard as its value. You can drag in currently selected key and type set selected key, but you won't be able to actually pass key press directly into the in selected key because the key press is a key structure which just holds the actual input. Like if it was gamepad face button bottom or if it's S on the keyboard, doesn't matter. It'll take either of those. But the in selected key is an input chord, which is what I was showing you earlier, where it has the key structure and then these other alternate keys as well. So make sure you split that like I did, and then pass the key pressed into the in selected key. And I know it's a weird name, but that's what they call it there when you split that. Now once you've done this, you're taking the currently selected key and you're setting this new value that we pressed to be the key on this variable. Now what we have to do is check and see if which one of these bindings this key relates to, and then update the binding. Okay, because this is a variable on this widget. It is not the variable on the change control screen. So it is not the jump input key selector. Might make more sense when we do it, so let's just get into it. So we have our owner widget, which again is going to be the change control screen, and that has access to all of the bindings that we could run into. So what I've done is I've gone and just said get and then the name of each binding that I have. I'm not going to go through them all because you see I have them here, but just go through and get them all like that. Once you have them all here, we can make an array of all the bindings, and then we can loop through the array and compare it to the currently selected key. Okay, so you can type make array like this, and then you can start putting in your bindings. Make sure you hit add pin for as many as you need, and then just keep passing them in. I have a make array with index 0 all the way to index 5, and that's all my bindings. And so now we have an array of all of our bindings on the change control screen. We have to compare them with the currently selected key to see if they are the same one as the one we're trying to bind. To do this, we can loop through everything in this array until we find it. One of them has to be the right one. So you could do this manually, or you could just do it with a loop, which makes it a little bit cleaner and definitely a lot less cluttered. So I do a standard for loop with break, not a for each loop, because I want to compare with them directly. So I do not for each, I do for loop with break here. So make sure they're green and it takes in a first index and a last index. That's what I've got here. Now the first index is going to be 0, but the last index has to be the last element in the array. You could hard code this, or you could just drag off the array, type length, then take this and do integer minus integer and subtract 1 from it. Reason being, length returns the actual number of elements in the array, which is 6 in this case. 0 through 5 is 6. But if we tried to access index 6 in this array, we would crash because it's index 0 through 5. So length minus 1 and passing that in the last index will allow us to go through every single binding in this array. Then we have to compare them against the currently selected key. Okay? So we drag off this array and we type get, and we can get a copy. Then we can get it at this current index. So whatever index we are in the loop is the value that we want to check. Okay, so index gets passed into this get, and we get the element in the array that we're on based on this index. So at index 0, we're on the jump binding. So we're checking the jump binding, and we're going to see if it's equal to the currently selected key. So you want equal object, which is this node here. Pass in currently selected key as the other option in this equal. And if they are equal, we are going to set the binding to be currently selected key. So we're actually going to override the jump binding to be this currently selected key. Remember, we just changed the value of currently selected key. So if we know that this button is equal to this button, but their keys are now different, we want to update jump binding to whatever's in currently selected key. All right, so bring this equal into a branch. And then we're going to drag off of our array, okay, wherever you have your reroute node or however you want to do it, and type set array elem for set array element. Then you need the index, which is going to come from the for loop with the break. And then you need the item. The item we're setting it to. So the item we're setting it to is the currently selected key. Size to fit can stay because we're just changing jump binding out for this currently selected key so that jump binding now matches this value. We're not updating the array or anything like that. And this is only going to happen if it's true. If it's false, we're doing nothing. We're just going to let it end, and then it'll go to the next item in the loop. So if we run the jump, but currently selected key was not trying to bind jump, it was trying to bind attack 1, then it's false, then it'll go to the next index in the loop, which is the attack 1 binding. At this point, we need to then break out of the loop. If we were able to set the array element, we know that we were only binding that key. The other keys aren't going to be bound to the same input. So we don't want to even try. We don't want to waste the time or the effort. So you can just bring set array element all the way back to the break node in the for loop with break. And then I've added some reroute nodes to make it look a little bit nicer. This will automatically send the loop to be completed. Once it's completed, there's two very important things we have to do. We have to make sure we set current widget back to none. At this point, we don't want the base player controller passing any data along to this widget because we're about to remove it. So we want to reset the reference so we don't crash or get an error. So we can grab our controller reference, or again, if you never made a reference, then just get it again using the methods we did in construct. And then say set current widget. And we're just going to leave it blank, which is going to set it back to null pointer. Setting it to null pointer will make this if statement fail right here, and thus it won't go into any of this logic. So we're going to reset that, and then we can remove this pop-up from the parent, or basically remove it from existence. All right. Now, once you do this, you will be able to properly use that pop-up. However, we need to get that pop-up to spawn and pass the proper data to it because you can't test it before that happens. So this logic is good in your solid. But we're not done because we need to go back to the change control screen and go to our confirm selection so that when we press confirm on more than just the back button, this is what we had in the previous episode. The false was not connected, so nothing was here. We're going to do everything that we need to spawn this widget and pass the appropriate data along. Now, if you want, you can actually copy this data from the last function we just made, because we're basically going to do the same thing. We're going to do it nice and using a for loop instead of manually. So in the previous episode, we determined that if the button we were currently focusing was the back button, then we just call P1 back and exit out of the menu. But now, assuming it's false, we need to grab the widget reference and say, if the widget we're focusing is one of these buttons, we need to pop up the control mapping pop-up widget and add it to the viewport. So if it's false, we're going to do the same logic where we make an array for all of our bindings. So we have all 6 of them in this array. Then I grab the length of the array, subtract 1, and set it as the last index in a for loop with break. Then I use the array to get the specific element at this index and check if it's equal to, this is what's different. Instead of checking like currently selected key, we're checking if it's equal to the widget reference from determine widget to focus. Essentially what all this is doing right here is checking if we are currently focusing one of these bindings. If we are, we take the binding that we're focusing and set that as currently selected key. Okay, so when we call create widget, because we're going to create our control mapping pop-up widget, you type this in, control mapping pop-up. Since we made these nodes, these variables, instance editable and expose on spawn, you see we see them on the create widget node. So now we have to fill these out. So you see I have it here. For the owner widget, I pass in self because the change control screen widget is the parent widget here. So self, get a reference to self. For the currently selected key, we're using whatever is currently used on these bindings. So whatever we retrieve from the array that was equal to the widget that we were focusing, that's the one we want to pass in. So the return of the get that we checked for equal here is what we pass into currently selected key. Then once this widget is created, we have to add it to the viewport. So you just drag off this, add to viewport, like that. And then you go and you break the for loop because we no longer have to do that. We don't have to look through the rest of those. We know which one we were focusing. At that point, guys, we are good to go. We can go in and we can search for our controls. We can scroll down and we can manually put in any inputs we want for any of these. All right, doesn't matter what we put in. Now, I'm still leaving the bind new key function disabled in change control screen so that I'm not overriding my inputs every time. As I told you in the last episode on this, we're going to update it and just make it a little bit safer so that we don't always clear out all of our input actions when we're going through this. But for now, I just recommend leaving it untouched until we get to that point. That way you're not having to reset your input and access mappings every single time. Anyway, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Really appreciate all the love and support, and I just want to thank you guys again for everything. So incredibly excited about everything we got working, and I'm glad you guys are going to get to see it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to assist you, and it's completely free. Anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.